Virginia, taken in the spring of 1987. They're holding hands. Their clothes are outdated by nearly 30 years. Behind them, you can see the foundation of a house that was supposed to have burned to ash in 1962 when the state police arrived that April morning. The children couldn't tell them how they got there. They couldn't tell them where they'd been. But what they could tell them, what they did tell them over the following 6 weeks, became one of the most disturbing child welfare cases in Appalachian history. This is a story the town of Briar Ridge tried to bury. And after you hear what those children said, you'll understand why. Hello everyone, before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. On April 19, 1987, a Sunday morning jogger named Melissa Carver was running along Route 42 just outside Briar Ridge when she saw something that made her stop cold. 3 children were standing at the edge of a cornfield, silent and still, like they'd been placed there. She described them later as looking wrong, not injured, not sick, but wrong. The oldest appeared to be around 12. The youngest couldn't have been more than 6. They wore clothes that looked like something out of a 1950s catalog, high-waisted trousers on the boys, a cotton dress with lace trim on the girl. Their faces were clean, but their expressions were hollow, empty. When Melissa approached them and asked if they were lost, the oldest boy looked at her and said, "We came back." She called the police from a gas station 2 miles down the road. By the time Sheriff Tom Decker arrived, the children hadn't moved. They stood exactly where she'd left them, hands linked, eyes forward. Decker would later tell a state investigator that in 23 years of law enforcement, he'd never felt unease like that. Not from a crime scene, not from a domestic dispute, from 3 silent children standing in a field. He asked them their names. The oldest boy said, Michael Grayson. The girl said, Caroline Grayson. The youngest said, Samuel Grayson. When Decker asked where their parents were, Michael looked at him with an expression the sheriff described as ancient, and he said, "They went into the ground a long time ago." The Grayson name meant something in Briar Ridge. In 1962, a fire had consumed the Grayson family home on Crescent Hill Road. Richard and Evelyn Grayson died in the blaze. Their 3 children, Michael, Caroline, and Samuel, were never found. The assumption for 25 years had been that their bodies were lost in the collapse, that they'd been burned beyond recognition, that the case, while tragic, was closed. But now, standing in front of Sheriff Decker were 3 children who not only bore those names, they matched the descriptions from the missing persons reports filed in 1962. Same ages, same faces, same birthmarks. It was as if they hadn't aged a single day. Decker placed them in protective custody and contacted the state. Within 48 hours, federal investigators, child psychologists, and forensic specialists descended on Briar Ridge. What followed was 6 weeks of interviews, medical exams, and psychological evaluations. And what those children said, what they described in calm, unwavering voices, was something no one was prepared to hear. The medical examinations came back impossible. 3 different physicians examined the children independently, and all 3 reached the same conclusion. Based on bone density, dental development, and physical markers, Michael Grayson was approximately 12 years old, Caroline was 9, Samuel was 6. These weren't adults pretending to be children. These weren't teenagers coached to play a role. They were children. But the children who disappeared in 1962 would have been 37, 34, and 31 years old in 1987. The math didn't work. Biology didn't work, and yet, fingerprints taken from a ceramic cup had touched during the first interview was sent to the FBI. They matched a partial print lifted from a toy fire truck recovered from Grayson home wreckage in 1962. Caroline had a crescent-shaped scar on her left wrist. Medical records from 1961 showed that Caroline Grayson had received stitches in that exact location after falling from a swing. Samuel had a birthmark below his right ear. The same birthmark appeared in a photograph taken at his 4th birthday party in 1961. Every biological marker said these were children. Every historical marker said these were the Grayson children, and that should have been impossible. The lead investigator, a woman named Dr. Laura Finch, had worked with traumatized children for 15 years. She'd interviewed survivors of abuse, of trafficking, of unimaginable horrors. But she said the Grayson children were different. They weren't traumatized. They weren't scared. They were calm. Disturbingly calm. When she asked Michael what he remembered about the fire, he didn't cry. He didn't flinch. He simply said, "We didn't die in the fire. We went down." Down, that word appeared in nearly every interview transcript. The children used it over and over. We went down. He took us down. It's still down there. When investigators pressed for details, Michael explained that on the night of the fire, their father woke them. He told them the house was burning and they needed to go to the safe place. The safe place, Michael said, was in the basement. But not the basement anyone could see. The other one, the one behind the stone wall, their father had shown it to them months before. He called it the old room. He said it was older than the house, older than the town, that it had been there long before any of them, and that if something ever happened, that's where they'd be safe. Caroline described descending a set of narrow stone steps that spiraled downward into darkness. She said the walls were damp and smelled like iron. Samuel, the youngest, said it felt like going into the earth's throat. When they reached the bottom, their father told them to wait. He said he'd come back for them. He never did. The children said they stayed in that room. They didn't know for how long. There was no light except a small opening high above them that let in a thin beam of sun during the day. They had no food, no water, but they weren't hungry. They weren't thirsty. Time felt slow, Michael said. Like moving through syrup, like being asleep, but awake. And then one day the door opened, not the door they'd come through, another door on the far side of the room, and someone came through. The children's descriptions of the man who came through the second door were consistent, but vague in a way that frustrated investigators. He was tall, they said. He wore dark clothes. His face was hard to remember, like looking at something through smoke. Michael said the man didn't speak out loud. He spoke inside their heads. He told them their father wasn't coming back, that the world above had moved on, that they could stay in old room, or they could come with him. When Dr. Finch asked where the man took them, Michael's answer was chilling in its simplicity. He said, "Nowhere. We were already there. He just showed us the rest of it." What followed in the interview transcripts is a series of descriptions that read less like testimony and more like fever dreams. The children described a place that existed beneath Briar Ridge. Not a cave, not a tunnel system, something else. Caroline called it the underneath. She said it was vast with corridors that stretched farther than you could walk. Rooms that changed shape and walls that breathed. Samuel described staircases that led to other staircases, doorways that opened into places that shouldn't exist, and a sound constant, low, rhythmic, like a heartbeat coming from deep below. They said there were others there, not children, not adults, people who looked like people, but moved wrong, stood wrong, watched wrong. Michael called them the kept ones. He said they'd been there a long time. Some of them had forgotten their names. The children said the man taught them things, how to move through the underneath without getting lost, how to listen for the heartbeat and follow it, how to avoid the rooms that pulled at you, the ones that tried to keep you. He told them they were special, that they'd been chosen because their father had made a trade, that the fire was never an accident, that Richard Grayson had known exactly what he was doing when he woke them that night. When Dr. Finch asked what kind of trade, Michael looked at her with an expression she described as unbearably sad, and he said, "Us. He traded us so the town would keep growing." Investigators initially believed this was a case of extreme psychological manipulation, that someone had abducted the Grayson children in 1962, kept them in an underground location, perhaps a bunker or basement network, and subjected them to prolonged conditioning and abuse that fractured their sense of reality. It would explain the distorted memories, the strange language, the calm detachment, but it didn't explain the medical evidence. It didn't explain how 3 children abducted at ages 12, 9, and 6 were still biologically 12, 9, and 6 25 years later, and it didn't explain what happened when investigators went to the site of the original Grayson home. The property had been abandoned since the fire. The foundation was still there, cracked and overgrown with weeds, but intact. On May 2, 1987, a team of forensic archaeologists and structural engineers arrived to examine the basement. They found the remains of original cellar, charred wood, collapsed stone, ash. But when they began excavating the northwest corner where Michael said the hidden room had been, they found something else. A seam in the stone, a vertical crack roughly 6 feet tall that didn't match the surrounding masonry. When they pried it open, they found a narrow passageway descending into darkness. The air that came out was cold, stale, ancient, and it smelled, according to the lead engineer, like iron and earth and something else, something rotting. They sent a camera down. It went 70 FD before the feed cut out. They sent another, same result. On the third attempt, the camera captured something before the signal died. A doorway carved into the stone and above it, symbols, not English, not any language anyone on team recognized. No one went down into that passageway. That decision came from the top. Federal authorities, after reviewing the camera footage and consulting with structural experts, declared the site unstable and potentially hazardous. The opening was sealed with concrete on May 9, 1987. The official reason given was safety. The unofficial reason, according to a retired agent who spoke to a journalist in 2004, was that no one wanted to know what was down there. Because if the children were telling the truth, if even a fraction of what they described was real, then it meant something had been living beneath Briar Ridge for a very long time, and it meant Richard Grayson had known about it. Investigators began digging into Richard Grayson's background. What they found painted a picture of a man obsessed. In the months before the fire, Richard had withdrawn from social activities. He'd stopped going to church. He'd begun spending hours in the town's historical society, poring over old maps and records. A librarian remembered him asking about the town's founding, about the original settlers, about what had been there before the town existed. He'd checked out books on local folklore, on Native American legends of the region, on geological surveys, and in the weeks before his death, he'd told his wife Evelyn something that she'd mentioned to her sister in a phone call. He'd said that Briar Ridge was built on a bad foundation, that the town had made a deal a long time ago, that someone had to keep paying. Evelyn's sister, Martha Hollies, was interviewed in June of 1987. She was 71 years old and still lived in Briar Ridge. She told investigators that her sister had been terrified in the weeks before the fire, that Richard had changed, that he'd become distant, obsessive, paranoid. He'd started locking the children's bedroom doors at night. He'd installed extra locks on the basement door. He told Evelyn that something was waking up, that it was hungry, and that if he didn't do something, it would take more than just his family. When Martha asked what he meant, Evelyn couldn't explain. She only said that Richard believed the town owed a debt and that he'd found a way to pay it. The fire that killed Richard and Evelyn Grayson was ruled accidental in 1962. Faulty wiring, the report said, but when investigators reviewed the original case files in 1987, they found inconsistencies. The fire had started in multiple locations simultaneously. Accelerant residue had been noted but dismissed, and a firefighter who'd been on scene that night had written in his personal log, never included in the official report, that the basement door had been chained shut from the outside, as if someone wanted to make sure nothing came up or that no one went down. The children's account suddenly seemed less like delusion and more like testimony, and that raised a question no one wanted to answer. If Richard Grayson had traded his children something beneath the town, what had he gotten in return? The answer might have been in the town itself. Briar Ridge had been dying in the 1950s. The coal mines were tapped out. The lumber mill was closing, young people were leaving, but in 1963, 1 year after the Grayson fire, things changed. A textile company opened a factory on the east side of town, then a packaging plant, then a distribution center. Within 5 years, Briar Ridge went from a population of 00 to over 4,000. Jobs came, money came, the town grew, and it kept growing. By 1987, Briar Ridge was thriving. New schools, new churches, new neighborhoods spreading up into the hills. It was a success story, an Appalachian miracle. But the Grayson children's return cast a shadow over that prosperity. Because if Richard Grayson had made a trade his children for the town's survival, then Briar Ridge's growth wasn't a miracle. It was a purchase, and the bill had just come due. The children were placed in foster care, while authorities tried to determine their legal status, but the placement didn't last long. Within 2 weeks, all 3 foster families reported the same problems. The children didn't sleep, not in any normal sense. Foster parents would check on them in the middle of the night and find them sitting upright in bed, eyes open, staring at the walls. When asked what they were doing, they'd say they were listening. Listening to what? To the heartbeat. They said they could still hear it, that it followed them, that it never stopped. One foster mother reported waking at 3:00 in the morning to find Samuel standing at her bedroom door. When she asked what was wrong, he said, "It knows we left. It wants us back." She called social services the next morning and refused to keep him another night. Michael told his caseworker that the man from the underneath had warned them that leaving had consequences, that the trade wasn't finished. When pressed for details, Michael said the man told them they could return to the surface, but they'd have to bring something back, a replacement. Someone to take their place in the old room, someone to keep the heartbeat fed. The caseworker asked who they were supposed to bring. Michael's answer was recorded in the case notes, underlined twice. He said, "Anyone, it doesn't care, it just needs to be fed." That statement triggered an immediate psychological evaluation. The children were separated and placed under supervised observation. But even apart, their stories remained consistent. Caroline told her evaluator the same thing. Samuel, despite being only 6 years old, used nearly identical language. They weren't making it up. They weren't coordinating, they believed it, and more disturbing, they seemed resigned to it. By late May, the town of Briar Ridge had become aware of the situation. News traveled fast in small towns, and the return of the Grayson children was the kind of story that couldn't be contained. At first, there was curiosity, then unease, then fear. People started asking questions. Why had the children come back now? What did they want? And why were investigators digging up the old Grayson property? Some residents began to remember things, strange things. A man named Howard Finch, no relation to Dr. Laura Finch, told a local reporter that in 1963, just after the town started growing, he'd been hunting in the woods north of Crescent Hill Road. He'd found a circle of stones in a clearing. In the center was a pit maybe 4 feet across, descending into darkness. He dropped a rock into it and never heard it land. When he mentioned it to his father, he was told to forget about it, that some things in Briar Ridge were better left alone. He never went back, but he remembered where it was. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Other stories emerged. A woman named Grace Pewitt said her grandfather had been one of the original town founders, that he'd kept a journal she'd found in his attic after he died. In it, he'd written about the old agreement. He didn't explain what it was, but he'd written that the town's survival depended on it being honored, that the land demanded payment, that every generation had to remember. When Grace tried to show the journal to a historian in the 1970s, it had vanished from her attic. She never found it again. A retired school teacher named Benjamin Tate said that in the 1940s, when he was a boy, his father had taken him to a town meeting in the basement of the old courthouse. He wasn't supposed to be there, but he'd hidden behind a stack of chairs and listened. The men were talking about the underneath, about keeping it quiet, about making sure the children stayed away from certain places, about what would happen if the compact was ever broken. Tate said he didn't understand it at the time, but after the Grayson children returned, he understood perfectly. The town had always known. On June 7, 1987, Michael Grayson vanished from his group's home. He'd been under constant supervision, but sometime between bed check at 10:00 p.m. and the morning shift change at 6:00 a.m., he disappeared. His window was locked from the inside. His door was monitored. There was no sign of forced entry or exit. He was simply gone. The search began immediately. Police, volunteers, tracking dogs. They combed the area for 3 days. On the morning of June 10th, a jogger found him. He was standing in the same cornfield where the children had first been discovered. Same spot, same position, hands at his sides, eyes forward, expression empty. When police arrived, Michael didn't resist. He didn't run. He let them take him back. But when Dr. Finch interviewed him later that day, he told her something that made her stop the recording twice to compose herself. He said he'd gone back down, that the door had opened for him, that the man was waiting, and that the man had given him a choice. Bring back what was owed, or all three of them would have to return permanently. Michael said he'd chosen to come back up to warn them. He said they had until the end of summer. After that, the underneath would come for them, and it wouldn't stop with children. Caroline and Samuel were moved to a secure facility in Charleston, over 100 miles away. Michael was placed in a psychiatric hospital for observation. The separation was meant to protect them, but on June 23rd, Caroline disappeared from a room in Charleston. Same circumstances, locked door, monitored hallway, no explanation. She was found 2 days later in Briar Ridge, standing outside the sealed entrance to the Grayson property. When authorities arrived, she was tracing the symbols on the concrete with her fingers. She told them she could hear it calling, that it was getting louder, that it was angry they'd sealed the door. A week later, Samuel vanished from his foster placement. He was found the next morning in the basement of an abandoned church on outskirts of town, kneeling in front of a stone wall, whispering to it. When asked what he was doing, he said he was apologizing. Apologizing to what? To the heartbeat, for leaving, for making it wait. The decision was made to keep all three children together under 24-hour supervision at a medical facility in Briar Ridge. Dr. Finch argued against it, saying the town itself seemed to be part of the problem, but she was overruled. Authorities believed proximity to mental health resources and the ability to monitor them as a unit outweighed the risks. That decision would prove catastrophic. In late July, staff at the facility began reporting strange occurrences. Equipment malfunctions, lights flickering, cold spots in the children's rooms, and sounds, deep rhythmic sounds coming from the walls like something massive breathing. The children became increasingly agitated. They stopped eating, stopped speaking to anyone except each other. And when they did speak, staff reported that their voices sounded wrong, layered, like multiple people speaking at once. Michael told a nurse that the time was almost up, that the underneath was stretching, that it was reaching up through cracks. On August 14, 1987, at approximately 2:30 a.m., every alarm in the facility went off simultaneously. Staff rushed to the children's wing and found all three of them standing in the hallway, holding hands, staring at the floor. When asked what they were doing, Michael looked up and said, "It's here." The floor beneath them began to crack. not from structural failure. The cracks moved like veins spreading outward in deliberate patterns, forming shapes, symbols, the same symbols that had been carved above the doorway in the Grayson basement. Staff tried to pull the children away, but they wouldn't move. Caroline said, "We have to go back now." Samuel said, "It's time to go home." And Michael said, "Tell them we're sorry. Tell them we tried." The lights went out. In the darkness, staff reported hearing that sound again. The deep rhythmic pulse, louder than ever, coming from below when the emergency generators kicked in. 30 seconds later, the children were gone. The floor where they'd been standing had collapsed inward, revealing a hole that descended into darkness. Rescue teams were assembled, but before anyone could enter, the hole sealed itself. The cracks in the floor smoothed over. The symbols faded. Within minutes, it was as if nothing had happened except the Grayson children were gone. The official report stated that the Grayson children escaped through a maintenance tunnel and remained missing. The investigation was closed in 1989. The facility was shut down and later demolished. The site of the original Grayson home was purchased by the town and turned into a small park. No excavation was ever permitted. No further investigation was conducted, and the town of Briar Ridge continued to grow, but something changed after August of 1987. People who lived there noticed it, even if they didn't talk about it openly. The town felt different, heavier. There were more disappearances than there used to be, not many, just enough to notice. A teenager would run away and never be found. A hiker would go into the woods and vanish. An elderly resident would wander from a nursing home and disappear without a trace. Always in the northern part of town, always near the old Grayson property, and always the searches would end the same way. No body, no evidence, no explanation, just gone. Dr. Laura Finch left Briar Ridge in 1988 and never returned. She refused all interviews about the case until 2003, when she spoke to a documentary filmmaker on the condition of anonymity. She said that Grayson children were telling the truth, that she'd spent 16 years trying to rationalize what she'd witnessed and she couldn't, that something existed beneath that town, something old and patient, and hungry, and that Richard Grayson hadn't been insane. He'd been desperate. She said the worst part wasn't what happened to the children. It was knowing that the town had allowed it, that somewhere in Briar Ridge's history, someone had made an agreement, a trade, safety and prosperity in exchange for occasional sacrifice, and that trade had never been broken. The children were just the latest payment. In 2006, a construction crew breaking ground for a new shopping center on the north edge of Briar Ridge discovered a network of tunnels beneath the site. Old tunnels, stone tunnels, the kind that shouldn't have existed in that region. When engineers descended to survey them, they found evidence of habitation. Not recent, ancient carvings on the walls, symbols no one could identify. And in one chamber, they found children's clothing, rotted, fragmented, but unmistakably from different eras. 1800s, early 1900s, 1960s. The discovery was reported to local authorities who contacted the State Archaeological Board. Within 48 hours, the site was sealed by federal order. The construction project was relocated. The tunnels were filled with concrete. No explanation was given to the public. The crew was paid for their silence, and the official record states that nothing of historical significance was found. Briar Ridge still exists, population just over 6,200 as of the last census. It's a quiet town, prosperous, the kind of place where people raise families and build futures. But if you dig into the records, you'll find patterns. Every 20 to 30 years, children disappear. Not all at once, not in ways that draw national attention, just quietly. One here, two there, and the town moves on. In 1934, the Miller twins vanished from their backyard. In 1958, a girl named Judith Carver disappeared on her way home from school. In 1962, the Grayson children. In 1997, a boy named Daniel Crest went missing during a camping trip. The searches always end the same way, and the town always keeps growing. Some people say Briar Ridge is cursed. Others say it's blessed, but the people who have lived there long enough, the ones whose families go back generations, they don't use either word. They just say the town has an understanding that it takes care of its own, and that sometimes taking care means making sacrifices. The Grayson children were never seen again after August 14, 1987. Their case remains officially unsolved, but in 2012, a hiker exploring the woods north of Briar Ridge found something carved into the trunk of an old oak tree. 3 names: Michael, Caroline, Samuel, and below them, a single sentence: "We're still down here." The hiker reported it to local police. When officers went to investigate, the tree had been cut down. The stump showed no evidence of carving, and the hiker, a man named Thomas Reed, moved out of West Virginia 3 months later. He told a friend he couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching him in those woods, that he'd heard a sound while he was standing at that tree. A deep rhythmic sound like a heartbeat coming from below. He said he didn't know if the Grayson children were still alive, but he knew they weren't alone. And he knew that whatever was keeping them, whatever Richard Grayson had traded them to, it was still there, still waiting, still hungry, and still very much awake. The town of Briar Ridge doesn't talk about the Grayson children anymore, but on quiet nights, when the wind moves through the hills and the houses settle into darkness, some people say you can still hear it, that deep rhythmic pulse, the heartbeat of something old, something that lives in the spaces beneath the world, something that remembers every deal ever made, and something that always collects what it's